Is this on? There we go. Okay. Hey, thanks for coming to my session. Come on in. Today we're going to talk about responsive design and what I'm calling out of the box and down the rabbit hole, and I'll kind of explain what that means. It's not a very basic intro to responsive design, although I certainly can get into some of that. It's more of an overview of the challenges that I've started to discover the more I get into this field of responsive design. See if my little clicker works. Doesn't. Okay, so who am I? I'm Dan Moriarty. I'm with the company Electric Citizen. We are a Minneapolis company, Drupal shop. I handle the design, development, front-end development, planning, and many other things for the company, and I sort of head up our responsive design efforts. So this was a good topic for me to get into, and I'm on Twitter at Minneapolis Dan. I wonder if I can see my PowerPoint notes while I'm giving this session. I seem to not be able to, so I'll just have to try and remember them. There's like a little notes bar, on the bottom of the keynote, and I'm not seeing it. So, all right. I just wanted to say a few words about my approach. We'll get into more of a broad overview, and I wasn't sure where to fit this slide, but I just wanted to say my experience with the responsive design, we largely use the Omega starter theme, so something that is pretty damn popular, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it or used it. When I do my responsive design up to date, I've been working basically from a normal grid and a fluid grid. Those are kind of the only two I've been using. I have a to-do item to start considering the people with wider screens, which is something I've been focused on the small screens and the mobile users, but I just came across a good article saying that there's a good 5% of your audience that's on fairly large screens. How about accommodating them in some way too? So something for me to do in the near future. I tend to, if we're talking responsive design, we usually are talking grids, so that's something we'll get into. There's all sorts of grid systems we'll talk about. I kind of subscribe to the theory that the fewer grid columns you have, the better you're off. You've seen 12 or 16 grid. If you're familiar with grid systems, 12 or 16 column grids are typical. I've kind of thought that 12 is probably enough, and if I can get by with 6, it's even better. And I have a to-do here. The best thing to learn if you're from responsive design is you're starting mobile first, right? And then enhancing your site as the screen gets bigger. As someone who's built desktop sites for so many years, I've been struggling with that process, and I have to admit that I still to this day am starting with the desktop and then shrinking it down, but that's on my to-do list to start changing that approach. So let's get into the topic. So, responsive design is not a big secret. Everyone who here has built a responsive site? Okay, so a good amount of you. And who is this responsive design kind of a new topic? A couple of you? Okay. And who's like a responsive design expert? That's good, because if there was an expert, I might just go sit down. So yeah, responsive design, it's amazingly awesome, fantastically wonderful, super trendy new thing you hear about everywhere. And you've probably seen the demonstrations. If you're new, you maybe haven't. We can look at some of those about how sites squish and stretch. They're fluid, they're flexible, depending on whether you're viewing it on a desktop or a mobile phone or tablet. It's the same site, just served up in different formats, different styles, depending on the device, so you don't have to build a separate mobile site. And it's so trendy, Mashable had an article, it's the year of responsive design. So I thought that was last year, but it's good to be ahead of the curve. So I just thought I'd, what would Dwight Schrute say in 2013? You know, do you do responsive design? No, then you're an idiot. So that's kind of his feeling on that. Okay, so for those who are new to responsive design and those in the know, you know, you can go to this URL, media queries. It's a good place to see a gallery of good responsive design in action. Let's see if I got some. They show you, you know, your desktop site and the screenshots. It's kind of nicer if you actually go to the real site. Drag your browser over. You get the different sizes. Actually, this doesn't quite adjust right, but I guess you do this. Okay, so where was I? Media queries, that's a great place to start. I don't know if he's truly the inventor of responsive design, but he sort of gets thrown around as that. Ethan Marcotte, is that how you say it? He's got a great book, Responsive Web Design. It's a great place to start if you're new, to read what he has to say. Also on my to-do list to read. But I have perused it. And while I'm in the topic, you know, for the sake of sharing what I learned, if you've heard the term adaptive design, web design versus responsive web design, and what's the difference between the two, I thought initially that meant adaptive is when you have a site and you squish it down, and it only changes at very set width points. So you have a main desktop site, and then it only changes when you get to the tablet, and it only changes when you get to the phone. And responsive meant it was constantly flexing no matter what the width, but that definition has changed, and now adaptive web design just refers to how your site can start to take advantage of the device that it's being viewed on. So for example, your site might change to more touch-based controls when you're viewing it on an iPad versus a computer, whereas responsive design is solely about the browser. But nevertheless, you know, responsive web design, it's all about watching your site stretch and squish, and it's kind of like cats stretching on a couch and old men playing accordions and whatever analogy you want to talk about. And since this is a Drupal camp, you know, let's look at some of these starter themes and what they bring to the table. I listed the 3 of the more popular ones, the ones that I've used that make mention and are highlighted for being especially responsive design friendly, or to my mind, they've been listed as sort of an out-of-the-box responsive experience, and I want to kind of explore what that means and what it doesn't mean. And I guess while I'm on the topic, I'm curious if there's other starter themes that you've used in the audience that you want to share that are good starting points for doing responsive design. See, anyone who's using Omega and Zen? Yeah. Anyone using adaptive theme? You have, yeah. You know, there's a few others, like there's a skeleton theme, there's Foundation, which is based on Zerb Foundation. There's, of course, you can always do your own custom one. So we'll look at what these starter themes offer out of the box. And, you know, just as a quick disclaimer, my whole talk is based on my experience essentially with the versions of these themes as of maybe 6 months ago. So things are changing rapidly, and Omega 4 just came out, which introduced a whole slew of changes. So this is not going to take all those into account. You know, Zen 7.5 has some awesome new responsive features, which I had hoped to explore in time for this session, but there was just no way. So what do these out-of-the-box solutions offer? This whole talk kind of came out of, for me, out of conversations I've had where someone might say, oh, you know, Omega, it's responsive out of the box, right? All we have to do is turn on this responsive checkbox and maybe fill out a few breakpoints and boom, you're done. You know, your site's responsive. And it seemed too good to be true. And maybe in the future someone will prove me wrong, but to my mind, that is certainly not an option. It's a good starting point. What do they offer you out of the box? They offer you some the ability for media queries at different breakpoints. You can set in the admin tools. You can, maybe I should just show you. There's my notes, but then you all see them too. I'll just go to this little fake site. So in Omega, if you go to your settings, here's your responsive settings, right? So size that it appears to your users, particularly on smartphones, and you could let them pinch and zoom, or you could disable that ability. You could go in here and say, I want to use when the screen size is, you type in some media queries here. They kind of give you some default ones. I kind of overwrote them, but they'll set you up by default out of the box, like, here's your grid for the desktop, here's your grid for the tablet, here's your grid for the smartphone. And so it all seems great, and it is. It's nice that they provide that. But, it's really great, but in my opinion, that's only maybe 10% of the battle. The more you get into this concept of an out-of-the-box responsive design, you start to see an endless bottom to it, and that's kind of what I want to talk to you about. So my point that I'm trying to make is there's no such thing as an out-of-the-box responsive website, as far as I know. I have to have a little disclaimer because someone might prove me wrong, but and why not? Well, here's some good reasons that we'll kind of delve into. For starters, these themes kind of all base you around this 960 grid system, and 960 grid system is awesome. You've seen if you built a site in the past, I don't know how many years, you've seen these grids, and you set your column widths, and you say, I want my main column to be 8 columns wide and my sidebar to be 4 columns wide, and it's great. But there's other grid systems too. There's this 1080 grid system that, if you like just a crap load of columns, you can download that, and unlike your 960 system, which is divisible by 3s or 4s, that one's divisible by, like, I don't know, a dozen different numbers. There's also this little 6-column grid, which I have used on a few sites, which I liked because it's 1,000 pixels wide. The math is a little easier to divide columns by. So maybe you want a custom grid. Well, then you got to really get into it a lot further than what these themes offer you out of the box. Sometimes, more often than not, you'll find yourself putting grids within grids. You'll have your main column, and then you'll put 2 boxes inside that, and when you squish that, some funny things can happen. So, and then some other things, maybe you want more than the default breakpoints. You have a custom design. There's all sorts of oddball items in responsive design that you have to be aware of, like tables and lists and forms, iframes, videos, and font sizing. And maybe your client gives you some crazy ass grid and says build your site, and you're going to have to really learn a lot more than what you get out of the box. So I'm kind of making this point. So let's just take a look at an example. So you're familiar with this type of layout where, let's just say this is a 12-column grid. I think it might be 24 actually, but let's just say it's 12. And you've got 4 columns here, 8 columns here, and then each of these images fits in the grid nicely, right? And when you take a site like that, okay, yeah, it's 24 columns. The numbers don't matter. But the point is that it all aligns to the grid. And the numbers are there, and if I just turn on Omega's flexible grid, it's all great. It says, switch these to percentages instead of fixed widths, and then I squish the page. And I don't know if you've experienced this with responsive design, but more often than not, it might give a nice percentage at the full width, but once you start squishing the page and then suddenly maybe you drop off a side column and grid values change up top, these grids within no longer fit nicely. And so how do you address that? That's not an out-of-the-box thing, and it's sort of a pain in the butt, but you want it to be more like this at a smaller size to fill up the space nicer. And how is this currently handled? Right now I just write a lot of overrides at different breakpoints. I say, the grid might be 23% when you're at full width, and then when you get to this width, then this specific grid changes, gets a little wider. It's just a lot of writing, and it would be nice if you didn't have to do that as much. And that is what some of the things that are currently being addressed through these concepts, like the semantic grid, SUSY, and Zen grids. What they do is they take this CSS code that maybe if you're a site builder, you're used to typing in right in your code, main call, and then you have a class of like, grid 8 or whatever, right? It's right in your HTML. They're saying take that out and instead just give it a semantic name like it probably already has, but just a semantic name like main column. I don't know if that's officially semantic, but that's semantic to me. This gets taken out and addressed all in your style sheet. And the great thing is then I'm not having to say, well, grid 8 equals, whatever, 800 pixels. But then later in my responsive design, suddenly the grid 8 equals, 400 or 100%, or I'm constantly having to override these values. And what these systems aim to do is kind of address the grids and in a great way. Zen grids is sort of attached with a Zen theme, but it's its own thing. You can use it on any Drupal theme. SUSY is compass driven. What this means is something new that's not out of the box. Now you have to start learning Sass or less. And for those who are not familiar, this is a new way of handling. Well, I don't know if I can do a definition justice. Who here is using Sass or less on your sites? Okay. Just curious, who's for Sass, and then who's for less? And does anyone do both? You just kind of do one or the other, don't you? So I'm not sure how that's all going to shake out. I decided to go with Sass myself as of literally 2 weeks ago. So it's all new to me to the point where I would never give a session on it, but I'm finding it's fairly easy to get into, and I really enjoy it. But the point is to start addressing some of these grid problems and avoiding some of the long grid overrides. Yes? Yeah, and that was part of my decision, is that Omega, the new version, uses Sass. I think Zen uses Sass, and it just seemed to have a lot of momentum, although I think Less has more users, but we'll see how that all shakes out. But anyway, the point is it's not out of the box at all. You've got to learn a whole new language to really start doing effective, responsive web design. Kind of touched on that. So, yes, sir?
For us that don't know, what are they? It's a new program to do what?
Oh, Sass. Yes, I'm sorry. So Sass it's many things. In one way, it's a way to write CSS with variables. That's one basic definition of it. So I can say, instead of having to write, if I have a button style, I don't have to write all these lines of code, right, in my style sheet, and then later there's another element that needs the same thing. So if I don't give it the same class, then I've got to write all these same rules again. And in Sass, I can just write that rule once in a base file and then reference it over here just by calling it whatever name I gave it. So I just call it button, and then I can just apply that to any field, include at button, and then it gets all those styles. So that's like very basic, but that's one thing that I've gotten into so far. And then of course there's all sorts of advanced uses, which I haven't even scratched the surface of. Yes, sir.
Can I just say, it's kind of like a shorthand CSS. It's a way of, instead of having to declare every single element in your selector, that you can just create a tree of elements and just kind of run through it.
Unless it's the same exact, same concept, it's just
Mm-hmm. I think there was a syntax issue that was challenging at first with Sass, where it was written a little different than CSS, but then that was kind of addressed. There's actually two flavors of Sass, but the one that I use, it's the same. You can write the same CSS that you do now. Then you have to have a compiler running in the background, and there's going to be a talk about this at camp, and it's kind of a deep topic, but it's something if you're going to do responsive design, I've started to realize it's really a slick approach, and it's something that you want to get into. So there's all these little trouble items that you encounter when you're doing responsive design that require some strange math computations, and so I thought I would kind of talk about a few of those and what I've learned, and hopefully share some tips with you, and then maybe you have some tips of your own. So one of the first things, slideshows. There isn't a site that can be built in the world today that doesn't have a slideshow, apparently, on the home page. It's absolutely imperative. Everyone wants the little rotating pictures on their. Who has built a site in the past year without doing a slideshow on the home page? You have 2 people. 1. Okay. All right. Well, good for you. You guys are awesome. So, and as an interesting aside, in our we've read some studies recently that say that, what was the percentage, Tim? 0.01 people sit and watch for the next slide to come by. So, not to do with this talk, but it's funny to know, and we'll probably keep building them as long as clients keep insisting on them. What's that?
Should I use a carousel?
Oh, okay, good tip. Should I use a carousel.com? And then the answer is no.
Well, there's about 8 slides.
All right, that's good. So if this is a Drupal camp, so if you know all about how often we use slideshow, so I'm assuming most of you have looked at or used Vue's slideshow. I think that's pretty safe to say. So my advice to you now is just forget that existed. Don't use it ever again. Use this flex slider. I'm sure there's other options too, but a good one is flex slider, and going in and replacing everything that I've done with this flex slider. Of course, there's a module for that. It's based on something that the Woo Themes people built. You just go to download the module, and then there's a JavaScript library for it. They typically, out of the box, will look something like this. You've seen with the little dots for pagers, which, also an aside, I've heard that people don't quite even know what these do, even though everyone uses them. Little buttons to scroll through. So anyway, get away from Vue Slideshow. Why? Because Vue Slideshow puts widths and heights in your code, inline. And to override them, when you're doing responsive design, you end up writing this a million times in your CSS. And I really hate doing that. It feels dirty and wrong, but I do it all the time if I'm dealing with some archaic slideshow. So that's tip number 1. Oh, by the way, is there another one that is good for responsive that anyone recommends besides Flex Slider? No? For a slideshow? Really? Okay. But is it responsive? Okay, yeah. Yeah, they work together, but it's almost the same module. I found that you need the one flex slider for views if you want to do cool things like an image pager with the flex slider. You want to download that because that's not as intuitive out of the box as maybe View slideshow was, or at least something that we had learned. You have to relearn. Tables are a problem. Avoid tables whenever possible. Of course, as you've been told for years, it's only for tabular data. Tabular? I don't know if I wrote the right word there. So there's several options to handle tables when you do need to use them. And of course, there's modules for that. The one that I found useful is the one that Zerb Foundation gave. There's this responsive tables module, which it's cool, but it's sort of based on this idea that you designate certain cell rows to drop out on smaller devices, right? And the problem with that people would argue is that you shouldn't be hiding data from people just because they're on a smaller device. What the Zerb Foundation came up with, and I've got this little screenshot, although that doesn't really do it justice. I wonder if well, we can look at it if we have time. But essentially what it does is it rearranges your table to keep this main column fixed, and then you can kind of slide with your finger and view all the row data as the table extends out. And so it doesn't hide anything, it just sort of makes it scrollable. And there is this link which talks about how to do it in Drupal using their method. You need this flexi filter module. So if you want to look that up later, I'll post the slide and try it out for yourself. Iframes are interesting as clients want to put Google Maps on their site or YouTube videos. They want to embed themselves, and they put it in an iframe. Iframes do not scale so nicely out of the box. And there's a great little solution that is talked about on this List Apart article. Essentially what you're doing is you're telling you've got a wrapper for your video, and you're giving it a relative position, and then inside that is the iframe, the actual video content or map, and you're giving that an absolute position. And with this little simple CSS, suddenly your iframe becomes responsive. Image maps, that's something that I had not thought about until recently on a site we're working on, where I built a little image map, and then I thought, oh, what happens? I've set these values to, this is a link, this is a link, and this is a link. What happens when I scale that? Because those, if you've worked with image maps, you know that those are setting fixed areas on your page, and when you scale the image, those image maps fall apart. Has anyone kind of dealt with this before, or feel me? So this guy came up with this little plug-and-play jQuery plugin, and this is just a quick demo. If you can see my little mouse turn into a cursor, and as you scale the image maps still stay intact. All you have to do is download it, plug it in. I actually have to say that I tried this and I had mixed results, but it's a good place to start. It works for this. I'm not sure why it didn't work for me, but it's a good place to start. Image maps do not play so nice. A small little tip I can give you if you've ever encountered this: if you take a responsive site on your iPhone or whatever smartphone you use, and you're viewing it, it all lays out nice, and then you go, I wonder what it looks like here, and you flip it, and suddenly it's completely changed. It's zoomed out. That's like a zoom bug with iOS prior to the new version 6. And if you have experienced that and wondering how to fix it, there's a simple little JavaScript you include, and then when you change orientation, it doesn't do that zooming thing where the site suddenly zooms out and you have to zoom back in. Okay, responsive views. Here's something I can share with you that maybe you hadn't heard of. Maybe you have. So who here hasn't used views in Drupal? Anyone? So we're all familiar with views and how it handles displaying data. You know, it's got things like HTML lists and tables and all sorts of things. So let's take a hands-on look at this to see if I can show you what I'm talking about. So here's a weird little array of images. But let's look at the view that's powering it. Okay, I actually got this little plugin called the Views Responsive Grid turned on. Normally, if you were laying out a column of images and views, you wanted, a row of 4 divs or images or whatever, you might turn on this grid plugin, and prior to Drupal 8, it's going to render your data in a table. And we all know that tables kind of suck for responsive design. So what do? Well, I was using HTML list for everything, which is fine. It works. I just save that. And fortunately, I had already set up these HTML styles for this list that said, for this view, float the list and make a certain width. And then in my responsive design, I said, okay, when you get to a certain width, change it to a full width. This is just a crappy demo, but okay, so it works, but you have to write all that extra code. Wouldn't it be nice if your view could do something more responsive? And that's what this little nice module does, called Views Responsive Grid. Who here uses that? Is it new to most people? So it's nothing super fancy, but I find it really useful. So I say, okay, let's use the responsive grid. So then what's it going to do? It's going to say, how many columns do you want to lay out your data? Let's do 4. And it's really basic. You just go to your column classes. Oh, interesting. I had done this earlier. I guess it doesn't retain its value once you select something else. So for the first column, if you're used to doing CSS with grids, you're going to make that first column an alpha grid, the last column an omega class. And for every column, I'm going to say grid 6. Now this kind of goes against what I said earlier about the semantic grid and all that, but that's for the future for me. So for now, I just type these values in, and then if I had more than one row, I do a little clear fix so that they don't bump up against each other. I save, and you're going to see kind of the same thing because I had already set those list values to match the grid. But now I don't have to because they're just using the grid values that are already there. Each one of these boxes is now grid 6. And then when I shrink it, it's going to look at whatever the responsive design is telling it to do. So when it gets to a certain width, it says, make this follow your responsive rules that you already wrote for grids. Okay, so that's, I think, pretty darn useful. So I don't have to write, this kind of CSS where I'm giving it percentage widths or percentage margins and all that. I can just rely on the code that's already in my grid. There's just a screenshot. So that's really useful. Responsive type, that's another topic. I think, that's not out of the box. Typography should change with the device being used. In most people's opinion, you don't want that big fat H1 header that looks great on a desktop at the same size when you're viewing it on the phone. And how do you do that? Well, that's something you're going to have to code yourself, right? There's a couple ways to do it. One is to, if you've set a width on your body class to be, you set a font size there, whatever, 14 pixels, that's what I actually use a lot. And then all your headers, you're using M's, so you say H1, 2M, or whatever. when you go to responsive, you could, rather than rewrite all these values, H2, 1.6, rather than going to responsive and then having to rewrite all these values, you could just go font size for the mobile phone 12 pixels, and then these will all change because they're relative to that, assuming you haven't set any font sizes in between these two. So I don't know if that makes sense. There's this idea of, instead of using M units, you use REM units. It's something I mentioned on the bottom here. That kind of helps with responsive design in the sense that I can do this same kind of thing, but without worry that if I had put one of these in a box and had set a font size on that, this 2M is going to be reflective of this box and not of the body, right? But the REM says, root M, whatever. I don't know what it stands for. Random eye movement. So that's a great advantage, because then I can more easily set up my responsive style sheets and just change the value of these. If I use REM instead of EM, then it'll always be reflective of this body, or even better, if you set the base font size on the HTML tag. It's just a shortcut, right? Problem is that it doesn't work, of course, with IE8 and below, so I don't think it's really viable for today. But another thing that I came across with recently, which I had never considered, maybe you had, but hover declarations are now worthless. It's something that I never thought of it, but of course, what good does it do to say change your link to red, or in this case blue, and add an underline if you're doing it on a tablet? Because there's no mouse, there's no hover. So it's completely worthless, and so I think we need to rethink how we display links. We have to make them more obvious. Color may not be enough, although that would be a start. Maybe we do have to start going back to underlining everything, or I guess you could just say when you're viewing a tablet, make sure all the links are underlined. I guess that would be one way to kind of keep things as they are, but change them for this concept that hovers are no longer necessary. So I'm kind of going into these little details, and I'm going to continue just for a little bit more, and then I want to get into kind of maybe the second big topic of this discussion, which has to do with performance, and that's really in my opinion, the rabbit hole that you start falling down once you get past the out-of-the-box stuff with responsive design. But before we get into that, I find this very fascinating too. This great site, in my opinion, responsivenavigation.net, it's showing you a variety of current patterns in responsive navigation. And you kind of see what they are and decide which one is best. I'm curious, for those in the audience who have dealt with this, if they have a preference in how they handle menus in responsive design. He's just showing you the different approaches. You kind of have to move the browser. You can see the links on the top, and then we just shrink to having a menu link that goes to the bottom. I use that on a site. The select menu, just change it to the regular old menu to a drop-down jump menu, as I call them. And yep. And I've used that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think and really if you I don't want to be just focused on the iPhone, because there's a whole other world outside the iPhone. But I do like on the iPhone with the jump menus, it's got the little dial that pops up when you want to select a value, and it's fairly quick to navigate that way. So for certain devices, it can be good. Although if you have a super long menu, it can start to look a little gross, right? So that's one option, and then just without going into all of them, this little, is this the one with the hamburger that everyone's using? Goes to this, and yeah, so kind of like that, although they don't have this little 3-line icon up here is what they call the hamburger, but that's what you see a lot of times for the responsive menu. And just one other one quickly is this, this off canvas, which you see a lot on Facebook, especially with their apps, where the menu slides off to the left. You click it, it slides back. You see that in a lot of apps these days. He kind of talks about, which is kind of interesting, he used to love this method. The downside is it can't accommodate a large menu with lots of subnavs. Which of these do you guys like to use, or is there something completely different? How many people you like the footer navigation or the little side pop out, or you like the jump menus? I've used those a lot. Anyone else? Menu overlay. Did I go over that one? Is that the one that does this? Oh, yeah. So that's the one that kind of, okay, yeah, I see the difference. There's that kind, and then there's the kind that Foundation used to use. Oops. And I always thought this was such an elegant, responsive menu for a long time. There's your menu, right? And then here's your little hamburger, and here it pushes down. Oops. And not only that, but there's like, if there's a sub-column, it sometimes slides out that. I think that's pretty slick. For those of you who use the Superfish module, which I suspect is a number of you for handling drop-down menus in Drupal, the new version 1.9, you familiar with that? They've baked in some of this responsiveness so that you can configure it to use the one menu, but then get this kind of effect with the toggle menu, right? So, and it handles if you have if this goes to multiple levels, it handles that too. And you have to do some CSS work for it, but the nice thing is you just have the one module and menu layout that you're used to with Superfish 1.9, and you get the responsiveness. So responsive navigation patterns, something very cool to consider. Of course, Brad Frost has some very good examples as well. Box model. So this is, to me, it's my new best friend for responsive design. It seems so ridiculous, but it's totally changed my world. As anyone who here has already wise to this method? Several of you. So for those who aren't, let's just talk traditionally. You would think if you have a box and you add padding to it and you add a border to it, if it's 200 pixels wide, even with adding padding and a border, it's still 200 pixels wide. What was decided many years ago was that no, if you have a 200 pixel wide box and you add padding to it, let's say it's 10 pixels on each side, suddenly your box is now 220 pixels wide. And let's say you have a border of a couple pixels, it adds to the width, right? So, and this is the way it was, and it wasn't a big deal. Matter of fact, one of the first things you learned was about box model hacks and how to get around this fact that stupid IE7 and earlier wanted to use this method, and it screwed up your layouts. And why couldn't they be like everyone else? And of course, now we've come full circle to realize how Microsoft was actually right in their method. And why is that? Because if you've got a fluid grid and responsive design, and you say, this box is 20%, and then when you scale it down, let's change the value, either it gets bigger or it gets smaller, whatever. But you've got padding to configure here too, because that's adding to your width. So suddenly you're like, the math just gets crazy. Do you know what I mean? Why this is a problem? And the easiest solution, I learned it from this Paul Irish fellow. There's other people that talk about it, but just add this to your CSS to cover all elements. That pretty much covers all browsers except IE7, in which case there's a little script you can add to cover that. By doing this, suddenly you go back to this old method, and if you're trying to calculate percentages of 4 or 8 boxes across the screen as it stretches and pulls, you want to know that this thing's width is a set thing. I mean, you don't want to have to be thinking about, oh, the padding changed and now it was 10 pixels and now it's, or 1% and now it's 0.5% or something. You know, it just gets crazy math. So embracing the box model method here, I don't know if you call it the box model method or box sizing, but go to this and it'll save you a lot of help. So, you know, what I'm trying to convey is all the complexity that you start to encounter as you get into responsive design and how this out-of-the-box concept is crazy. You know, so with that, I want to just go into continuing down the rabbit hole and getting into yet another layer of responsive design. You know, the thing you start to learn is it seems fairly easy, but it really gets hard after a while. You know, I suppose like everything, but responsive design, the more you think about it, the more you get into it, it really gets hard. And there's a lot of things to consider. Besides all these things about iframes and tables and grids, you know, start to think about performance, which is sort of where everyone's mind is on responsive design these days. Well, not everyone. A lot of people's mind is on these days, and I think it's something that we're all going to be having to factor into our work. And what that means is, you know, you've got your nice site that's the same site for everybody, and the desktop user gets it, and the mobile user gets this smaller version of this site. But, of course, the problem is that the desktop user is sitting there on the local network, and they've got fast speeds, and it doesn't matter that this page is 400K. But the same page is being served up to this person on their mobile phone, and they're on I-94 in the middle of Wisconsin, where there's virtually no internet connection. So how do you handle that? So one of the things you can do to start off with is this site that's free, offered by Akamai. You can go here. You can enter your website URL. Right? And see a performance test on how it does on different devices. It kind of gives you a starting point of how fast or slow your site is. So I haven't done a lot of performance optimization on our site, so I'm imagining, of course I'm waiting in a test queue, so it'll give me the results later, but I'm imagining it could be much better. So that's a starting point, and then you can kind of go back and check after you've done some work on how to reduce your file size. And where do you start? You look at images, you can look at scripts, and you can reduce markup. And I'm not going to get too deep into images because Mark Drummond over there is going to give a talk about responsive images later today. So that's awesome because then I don't have to get into it. But just real quick, since I wasn't aware of that when I started this, I was going to talk about some of the approaches to responsive images or adaptive images, however you want to call it. The general idea here is that rather than serve up the same size JPEG for everybody, no matter what the device, wouldn't it be nice if this huge image on a desktop, which is weighing in at like, I don't know, 80K or something, wouldn't it be nice if rather than just take that image and squish it down for the phone, but it's the same download size, wouldn't it be nice if I could just put like a, you know, like a 4K image here instead, swap it out, right? That would save some bandwidth, that would save some download speeds. And so some of the people that have thought about this, there's this adaptive images site that's kind of has talked about this in length, and some of these modules kind of grew out of this idea of adaptive images. There's 2 listed here. And the approach with Drupal, which again Mark will get into, is you can assign an image and then swap out a different size depending on the device being used. So those are really cool. I think this picture code that's come out of the responsive images community group is sort of the future. It's certainly been embraced already by Drupal 8, so you'll be learning more about this, but essentially what it's doing is rewriting your image tag using this picture element. You're able to say right in the code, this is if you're handwriting in Drupal, it's going to be different, but you know, if the page is only this wide, you can use this image. Otherwise, use this image, and then this is the fallback image. So you're able to swap in different images all kind of in one chunk rather than separately. And honestly, like, this sounds really good. And like I said, Drupal 8's doing this. There's a module that's out for Drupal 7. Oops. That you can use Drupal configuration to start using the picture module and set up different image sizes depending on device being used. It honestly seems like a pain in the butt, right? You have enough to do, and now you have to start worrying about like every image on a site potentially saving out 3, 4, 5 different versions, and so maybe it's not for everyone. I think it's where we're headed, and it's something we have to learn. Maybe we do it on a select basis for just the largest images on the site. I'm not sure. Awesome. Good. Stick around. Some other things, it's been touted for a long time, this SVG format, scalable vector graphics. I don't know if anyone's used those. One person? Kind of, 1.5. It seems like it's been a long time coming, and I still don't really see it happening. Font icons, it looks like we're kind of running short on time, so I want to speed up through this. Are a cool way to embed little icons on your page without having to load images or having to load one image of all these icons and then moving it around with your CSS. Use font icons so you can start including little custom bullets on your page, and you're downloading this thing once, and you're not having to download all the images separately. So font icons are pretty cool. I've tried out this We Love icon fonts. That's one place to start. That's where I got the screen grab. Data URIs. If you haven't, I'm not even sure how you make those. I'm sure we just Google that. But the idea is that you take an image that you're using a lot. Like let's say you have a custom bullet image and you want to use it a lot, rather than calling that from your images, you actually embed that image as code in the CSS, which seems a little crazy, but there's some performance benefits for certain images. And then, of course, there's this option of content delivery networks, which there are some open source ones out there. What that means is they help serve up content to people around the country for you, so speeding up download times. Okay, how about if I just get into this last topic of jQuery. jQuery is something that's in Drupal. It's everywhere. It's really great, and it's awesome, but it's fairly large. And this graph attempts to show you over the versions how it's increased in file size over the years. So it's over 200K uncompressed, and we include it on all sites, regardless of whether you're a desktop user or mobile user. Is there a way we can shave off some file size from that? Maybe all that library includes we don't need for every site on a mobile phone. So it's, you're getting back into these very small values, but the truth is that with everyone using mobile devices, any file size you can shave off would help. So what alternatives are there to just your basic jQuery? Well, it's sort of an area that's still being explored. There's this Zepto.js, which is a tiny little library that I believe replicates some of the core functionalities of jQuery, but it drops off a whole ton of stuff that maybe you can get by without. There's some talk on Drupal about how to integrate that into Drupal site, although there's no module or anything that I know of. Another one is this closure compiler that Google has, and there's a module for that, and that attempts to address file size with your JavaScript as well. the fences module, if you're not familiar, it lets you go into Drupal and say in the code rather than spit out, for a typical page, you get like 10 divs and a bunch of spans and extra elements. Even that kind of stuff can add file size. So if you can reduce your markup, you get a faster site. And the fences module can do that by letting you go into Drupal in a graphic user interface. You don't have to code it and say, don't do that. Just give me H3 header for this block of text. So if you haven't played with that, that's another good one. I was going to talk about content, but in this whole idea of how are we going to adjust content depending on the device being used. Like, let's say you're looking on the internet on your refrigerator, or all these crazy topics about, wouldn't it be cool if we could serve up a different story for this mobile user versus the one on the desktop? It's a shorter amount of content, but the truth is that I don't think we're anywhere near doing that. So it's still evolving rapidly, but I just wanted to say that if responsive web design is going to truly be the answer to mobile society, it has to do more than stretch and pull. We have to think about performance. We have to think about all these strange elements. We have to think about like the iframes, the videos. We have to think about images, image maps. We have a lot to do. So the out of the box ends up being a much deeper experience than I realized, and maybe you do too. So and I'll have some links I'll post to some sites I found useful when I post my slides. And looks like we're out of time. Does anyone have any questions for me? Yes, sir. So you mean having in terms of code management, having one set of style rules to work from, and then as a themer, adjusting that depending on the device you're using, I think it's more cohesive. It's easier transferred to other people to work on as well than to maintain separate themes. You want to have, well, I mean, it's a good question because that was an approach, right? Or does someone have some comments in response to that? Or?
The mobile site tended to be based on site connection, trying to say, bring in the device string and saying, okay, this device, we're going to serve this stuff. And there's like hundreds of devices out there. Like keeping on top of that is just nuts. They all have different sizes and things like that.
So there's the good answer is the number of, the number of devices you have to account for. Mm-hmm.
Please don't come out and say that, like the larger companies can afford it, but the smaller companies that you're never going to be traditional sites.
Yeah.
The content of it
Is daunting, yeah. So it looks like we're out of time, but feel free to hit me up with questions. I hope that was helpful, or I can be helpful in some way to this topic, and thanks a lot for listening.